Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I did this Ladybird drawing in graphite. Now I'm going to have lots of tips in this video on how to use graphite powder to maximise the level of realism in our graphite drawings. Now starting off here, I'm using a round soft tool and I'm using my graphite powder to block in more of a standard grey over the entire background. Now the reason I'm using graphite powder here is because this is giving me a real softness very quickly early on. Now when working with sections that are out of focus or just large areas of graphite such as backgrounds here, this works really well. Now I love graphite powder and I use it in every single one of my graphite drawings. It has lots of different uses, many different effects that it can create. But certainly here how quickly we can get the graphite in place is a massive bonus. Now one thing I do when I work with graphite powder is build it up in stages. I'm trying to work a little bit more cautiously here so I don't go too dark too soon. But one of the things to remember with graphite powder is it can only go so dark. So if we do want to have a really dark background, dark layers of graphite on the subject, then we will have to come back in with our graphite pencils to reinforce that. Now as I start on the subject, I'm going to be using the same cautious approach. I'm not jumping into my darkest pencils early on, and I'm going to be able to maximise my depth and more importantly, the shine on this ladybird as I build my layers. Now by building my layers like this, it gives me more control and flexibility with what erasers I can use. And this is something that I'm also going to demonstrate as I progress through this drawing. And this brings me on to a question that I'm asked more frequently, and that is, why are the erasers not working? Now most often I find that this is caused by the graphite not being applied in the right way. Now this is something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time step-by-step versions of these tutorials. Where I'm able to build up my layers more subtly here, I'm working with more of a cautious approach as I've mentioned. It means then that if I have to come back in with an eraser, I'm going to be able to effectively remove that graphite more easily because I haven't burnished early on. Now burnishing is where we apply too much pressure to the pencil and then flatten the tooth of the paper. Now burnishing is a wonderful technique to use at the right point. I do it myself, but I keep it more for my later layers. Now by burnishing too early on, we can push that graphite into the tooth of the paper far too much, and therefore it means the erasers are going to have a much harder job to lift that graphite where needed. Now my preference here with any portrait that I am drawing or painting is to work in small sections. Now particularly for something like this where there's no obvious key facial features, you can't really see the eyes, what we would associate as a nose for example. I therefore want to break this up into even smaller sections. Now for this, for an area where there might be specific markings such as the white patches, any obvious shine, I'm going to map those in first so that I know I've got those visible. This is going to make a more complex and confusing area far easier to tackle. Now as I start to build up my layers yet again in gradual stages, I'm really focusing on any areas of the reference photo where there are particularly bright highlights. Now high contrast is a top priority of mine with any medium that I'm working in. It's something that I focus more on than worrying about the exact colour. Graphite is a wonderful medium for teaching us this because we don't of course use colour at all. Now as I'm focusing on my contrast here, one of my biggest tips is if you have any areas that need to be as bright as you can possibly get it, a really light highlight, then allow the white of the paper first of all to show through. And I do that here in many different areas. Any areas that are particularly white with these white patches, those specific markings, I've actually drawn around those and then I've shaded any mid-greys or lighter greys on top if I need to. But certainly a bright highlight in the eye, I wouldn't hesitate to leave the white of the paper entirely if that reflection was really bright. This is a good way of enhancing that contrast as much as possible. Now it also comes down to how dark we can get the graphite as well. Now achieving dark graphite and building up as much depth as possible without jumping into the darkest pencils right away at that first layer is something that can really enhance the level of realism that's achieved. Now, because the way that we build up the graphite here is so crucial, this is of course something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time versions of these tutorials. I create them with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment. Now, this makes even the most complex subjects easier to tackle. So if my real-time step-by-step lessons are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. Now, as I've been building up the layers on the body here, I'm really focusing now on the shine. So I'm using my putty eraser to pull in some of those highlights and lift off some of those layers of graphite. Now, one of the things here that's really important is once I've pulled in my highlight, if the shine is subtle, it's got more of a curved appearance such as this, I'll come back in with my graphite pencils exactly as I am here, and I'll actually just soften the edges a little bit more. Now, you don't have to use a graphite pencil for this, you could actually use graphite powder as long as it's not too dark. By softening this, I'm just getting a little bit more of that curved indication on that reflection. The shine on that ladybird here is going to be more enhanced because I'm gradually then adjusting my shape and my values. Now, the shaping here is something that is really important. We want to make sure that we've got the highlights and shadows in the right place. Now, this is something I talk a lot about in my YouTube videos here, especially when drawing fur or feathers. However, it still applies when drawing something like this that has more of a harder but rigid shape. Now, when I'm mapping in my highlights and my shadows, the placement of those here would actually determine how curved the body is. So if I was to lower a highlight or I was push it over to one side, I'm then going to make that body shape change. So this is something that I do focus on completely from the initial layer really. I like to block those in or at least map them in, get an indication of where they should be placed, because then I find it much easier to follow my reference photo as I build my layers. Now, as I started working on the leaf, this is where I'm going to go back focusing more on the application of my graphite powder. Now, one of the big differences here is I'm using a smaller applicator. This is just a normal eye makeup applicator, and again I'm just focusing on my softness, which is why I'm using graphite powder first. Now, when I'm working with something that is more out of focus, I really do want to make sure the edges of that area are even softer. I don't want to overblend because I still want there to be slightly more of a defined edge. You can see here that I've got a highlight on the top part of that leaf, but then the darker section of that background. This is indicating at that separation. But if I wanted to give that more of a slightly in focus look, it's not necessarily about forcing in detail. In this situation, it would be just making that darker section of the background, that edge where it meets that highlight of the leaf, a little bit more defined. Slightly more of a harsher look, but I would do that with my graphite powder rather than my pencils. Now, when working with a larger area of graphite here, it's really important not to rush. I never like to work with just one solid layer of graphite and then call that base layer finished. For me, my base layer is a crucial part of the drawing process. I do find that this actually maximises the level of realism and also enhances the details significantly. So this is always a stage that I slow the process down and get this just right. Now, when I'm working with this shadow underneath the ladybird, this is something where I'm going to have to enhance that with my graphite pencils. The graphite powder just can't go dark enough, but I can certainly already indicate at where the shadow is going to be. So again, at this base layer stage, I'm trying to make this as accurate as I can so that that reference photo is much easier to follow. Now, one of my biggest tips when working on something like this, where we're building in more of the values for more of the entire drawing, is to always look at the other sections in that reference photo. So what I mean by that is it's very easy to get carried away with this is a shadow under the animal, therefore it needs to be completely black. However, that might not always be the case. So one thing here that I find really useful is to look at the reference photo and the drawing, look at the sections on the face and then the shadow under the ladybird and think, right, how dark should the shadow be in comparison to the darker values on the face? If it's not as dark, then I know I don't need to use maybe my darkest graphite pencils. I can get that balance just right. So by using the other information in that reference photo, we can then better judge what range of values we need for the rest of the drawing. Now when I come back in with my erasers here, adding those highlights on the edge of the subject, this is now giving that separation from the shadow underneath and the subject itself. Now it might only be a very tiny highlight of barely 1 or 2 millimeters, but it's enough there to give that isolation that now that subject is perched that much higher from the leaf in this example. It just helps with the additional dimension that we can capture here. Now I've already mentioned many times about how defining more of an edge and then softening something else can help to enhance the depth. Now on this specific side of the leaf, I wanted it to be a little bit more defined, slightly harsher because of that highlight. Whereas on the back surface at the top left corner here, I actually wanted to make this look a little bit softer, slightly more out of focus. So to do that, I'm going to use my paper blending stump and graphite powder to darken these values. That's going to help then soften that into that slightly darker corner of the background as well. Now this side of the leaf, it did have some shadows, so I'm not inventing random shadows just to push this part back. But getting the values right here is what's helping me to achieve more of that softness in this corner. And this is where the values just needed to be adapted a little bit more. Using my putty eraser, I can then create very soft highlights without making those highlights too bright. If I was to use more of a rigid eraser, such as the Tombow Mono Eraser, I'm then going to have more of those highlights that are too crisp, too detailed. Now that isn't necessarily a problem because I could use my graphite powder back over the top to soften those in. That's something that can certainly work, but it just then is an extra layer more time to get to the same effect, which is why graphite powder for something like this is my very first go-to approach first. Now the last few minutes of a portrait is where I'm refining those contrasts, the values. Using my putty eraser here, I just wanted to capture a little bit more softness on the outer edge of the leaf, just again to pour a little bit more focus on the subject. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.